America rising in the wake of the attack on America. Dan Rather reporting from CBS News World Headquarters in New York on this National Day of Prayer and Remembrance. In the Eastern Time Zone, it's now just past 3 p.m. President Bush has arrived in the New York area for a first-hand look at the devastation surrounding the World Trade Center. Earlier, President Bush and 4 former presidents of the United States attended a solemn memorial service at Washington's National Cathedral. The Justice Department announced a short while ago it now has 4,000 FBI agents working on the case. Also at this hour, there are these developments. The President signed an order authorizing the call-up of as many as 50,000 reservists, the first of them to be notified within days, a special emphasis on National Guard and Reserve pilots. Both houses of Congress now have approved a $40 billion package, what's generally described as a beginning package to both prosecute military action and provide relief to terrorist victims. A lot of that federal money will come to New York City. The Justice Department has named the suspected hijackers, putting their number in the sky at 19 assassins in the airplanes. Rain in New York is making the rescue and recovery effort more difficult. The official death toll at all locations now stands at nearly 600. The number of missing is about 5,000. We go now to Jim Stewart in our Washington Bureau. Jim?
Dan, I want to be careful not to overstate this, but I think it is significant. The federal authorities have 2 people in custody who are apparently cooperating. And while it is not clear that they were a part of the terrorist incidents that occurred Tuesday, they may have significant knowledge about that. This falls far short of arresting any specific colleagues of the 19 men who were involved in the hijackings and crashes on Tuesday, but it does seem to signify that the FBI is making some clear progress in this. Whether these 2 individuals will end up being criminally charged is just not clear at this point. Meanwhile, the Justice Department is saying that it is being flooded literally with tips from the public, 30,000 over the internet alone, and has its handful just looking out after those, as well as a list of 100 people which they're calling a watch list that they would very much like to talk to and are looking for around the country today. Dan?
Jim Stewart in Washington. We go to Bill Whitaker in our Los Angeles Bureau. In Los Angeles, airport security remains a very large concern. Bill?
Well, Dan, there's an intense desire, it's almost palpable, that people want to get back to some sense of normalcy, but events, it seems, just won't allow it. As Ed Bradley was saying earlier, there was a heavily armed man who tried to attack a mosque in the city of Seattle. He was arrested. Just in the suburbs north of Los Angeles, a Syrian-born convenience store owner has had his shop shot up 2 nights since the bombing on Tuesday. And as another sign of how things might be difficult to get back to normal, at the international airport here in Los Angeles, long lines and long waits are going to be common. People are going to have to approach this flying on domestic flights as though they were on international flights, getting in 2 hours early. Here in Los Angeles, cars are not allowed to drive up to the curb as before. People will have to park at outlying parking lots, take shuttles into the airport. It seems that things will not get back to normal, and this all in the light of recent reports that the FBI is saying that 3 of the 19 suspected hijackers lived here in Southern California. Dan?
Bill Whitaker in Los Angeles. We take you now to northern Pakistan, which faces the so-called territories that are a very thin buffer between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Basically, Pakistan butted up against Afghanistan. And our CBS News foreign correspondent, Alan Pizzi. Alan, what's the situation there at the moment?
Dan, the latest news reaching here from Afghanistan is a shout of defiance from the Taliban. They're telling their people that to be steadfast, they expect American attacks, and they're saying that the Taliban, the Afghanis, will seek revenge should America attack. They're also saying that it's no use coming for Osama bin Laden because you won't find him with missiles, is how one of them put it. And they said if America wants to come in here any other way, remember what the Afghans managed to do to the Russians. So the Taliban are showing defiance. At the same time, here in Islamabad, they held a press conference saying, but everything can be solved by dialogue. America has not yet approached us. Don't be too quick to point fingers. Present some evidence, then we can talk about it. So two sides to the coin from the Taliban, both of them basically in defiance of America, Dan.
Alan, the United States has urged Pakistan to close its borders with Afghanistan. Any indication that that is in fact being done?
We're hearing rumors that the border has been closed, Dan, but it's not sure to what extent. We also understand that the Pakistanis have been asked to shut down supplies to the Taliban, things like fuel, crucial things like fuel. We're also hearing that the equivalent of the Joint Chiefs of Staff here met for a long time today. Basically, they came out saying they were unanimous in accepting proposals that had been put to them for ways to cooperate with America. Those proposals will now go to the Pakistani cabinet, which should meet tomorrow, and the expectation is that that too will get approval. However, there have been suggestions that if anybody's trying to come up with the idea of putting American ground troops into Pakistan, that's another matter. The mood on the street is, no, we're not interested in that. We read at some of the mosques today. It was Friday prayers. The speeches were very sympathetic towards America, very condemnatory of the terrorist outrages, but at the same time, there was a line that basically said, don't point fingers too fast. And then we talked to a couple of analysts and people on the street, and they say, wait a minute, you don't treat us like we were Saudi Arabia in the Gulf War. Coming in here with American ground troops would be, to a lot of Muslims here, would be insulting, and that's a problem that the Pakistan's leaders are going to have to solve. Internal political dissent, should Americans ask for staging posts here, and should they decide to provide that, Dan?
Well, for example, Alan, one of the things being talked about is allowing American supply and logistics and support access to Pakistan's ports. Are they aware, that is, certainly the government's aware, but the people you've talked to outside of the government, are they aware that that kind of a request is being made?
No, these requests have been kept very quiet. They've just basically said in the press that requests have been made. Pakistan is against terrorism, will do all it can to help America. They want to be friendly. The specific details are not known to the general public. It's just that the general public, I think, is making assumptions that more may be asked of them. They're a bit antagonistic toward America still. I wouldn't say this place was anti-American, but America is blamed for some of Pakistan's troubles. America has imposed sanctions on Pakistan. That hurts the ordinary person in that there's not a lot of investment and development here. They've had drought. They've got a lot of problems. And they think that more could be done, and they don't see that America is their best friend at the moment. And they're kind of wondering, I think, why should we go any further than we have to? It's a diplomatic job for the government to convince its people that this is in everyone's best interest, Dan.
Alan, true or untrue that the Taliban has, in effect, has schools for terrorism in northern Pakistan, set Afghanistan aside, that they have some in northern Pakistan?
They certainly have recruiting grounds and teaching grounds, Dan. Remember that the Taliban basically grew up in the Afghan refugee camps along the border, grew up, I might add, under the eye and even encouragement of the Pakistani intelligence services, which were very strong. Nothing happens here without them knowing it. They let it happen. In the northern frontier districts, up along that wild frontier area that the British never managed to take and no one ever managed to really govern up there, there could be camps, there could be all kinds of things. It's sort of, I went up there once years ago when we were sort of sneaking into Afghanistan, as you know about how that happened. And as we crossed a certain point, the driver smiled and said, "Here, no more government." And all we saw were armed men. The government had no rule up there, probably still doesn't. There could well be training camps there. Certainly it's an area where they inculcate the young refugees with the idea of radical Islam. That's where the Taliban schools began. That's where the young fighters came from. Whether they train them militarily there today, I would doubt that, but the ideology still exists there, Dan.
Well, Alan, it is certainly so that Americans need to understand that particularly that area of northern Pakistan going across the mountains into Afghanistan is, to put it as gently as possible, a rough neighborhood. We go now to former Defense Secretary William Cohen, who's in our Washington Bureau. Mr. Secretary, thanks again for being with us. Let's talk for just a moment about the reality that when we talk about doing something in or around Afghanistan, there are a minimum of 4 nuclear powers there: Pakistan, India, China, and Russia, what used to be the Soviet Union, and possibly a 5th in Iran.
That's correct, Dan, and you have had perhaps more experience than most in visiting and understanding that area. I think we should be very cautious in what we are calling upon the Pakistanis to do. I think it's very encouraging that President Musharraf has indicated, at least preliminarily, that Pakistan is willing to be helpful to the United States in curbing terrorism. But I think it's unwise and imprudent for us to speculate exactly how much they're prepared to bear at this point. I think less said about what Pakistan is prepared to do is probably the better. There is nonetheless a violent element within Pakistan, and as previously stated, they do not look favorably upon the United States. The last thing we want to see is too much pressure put upon President Musharraf that ends up in him being removed from office with the radical elements taking over, who would then have access to nuclear weapons. And so I think they can be helpful, and I think we should pursue ways in which they can be helpful, but we ought not to be discussing it at length publicly until such time as we're satisfied we have a level of cooperation that would facilitate any operation we might contemplate in the region itself.
Keep in mind, Mr. Secretary, of your experience in China, try to illuminate some that the Chinese have been in some ways at least roughly allied with Pakistan at the expense of India, and this is part of the dynamic with which we're dealing.
Exactly right. To the extent that we are now leaning quite favorably toward India, and the Pakistanis are looking at that particular relationship and exactly deciding where they intend to go with this. China is not going to allow Pakistan to be overwhelmed by any sort of predominant level of support from the United States to India without some counter-reaction from China. They're going to try to keep some kind of a balance here because they see India certainly as a competitor in the region. So we have to, again, be careful. I was happy when President Clinton made a trip to India to start a new rapprochement with India. I also was encouraged that he stopped in Pakistan. I think we have to do more with the Pakistanis. I think that we have to build a relationship with them as well. And to the extent that we can do that under this particular unfortunate situation, so much the better. But I think we have to be careful, approach it with a good deal of diplomacy and delicacy, and that's why I think Secretary Powell and others are now talking in precisely these terms, looking at the entire situation, not from a strictly military point of view, but a combination of military, diplomacy, as well as economic instruments of power.
Mr. Secretary, it was true in the Clinton administration, and even truer with the still new Bush administration, that Chinese military leaders with whom you have met are very much concerned about a movement for, quote, containment of China. Are they or are they not going to be very concerned with a U.S. military presence in Pakistan? I have to believe they're going to be nervous about this, because if they're not paranoid about a, quote, U.S. containment policy, they have been something very near that.
I'm not satisfied at this point that we are looking for any sort of a forward-based presence in Pakistan. I think what we're looking for is a number of opportunities to help combat terrorism. But I would be reluctant at this point to say that we are searching a commitment, looking for a commitment from the Pakistanis to have American bases on their territory. I think that in my judgment, be a mistake. And it would, in fact, cause a great deal of tension with China and how they see the United States in its effort to combat terrorism. So this is something that we ought to be exploring very diplomatically, very cautiously. I am encouraged, Secretary Powell is encouraged to see a positive response coming from President Musharraf, who is a military man, former military man. And I think that our relationships that we have had with him are proving quite productive and fruitful at this point. But we ought to be careful in what we're asking him and the Pakistanis to do under the circumstances with so much volatility in the area between Pakistan, India, the fight over Kashmir, the fear on the part of China that we might be trying to expand our influence in the region to their detriment.
Mr. Secretary, going in another direction, we're a nation of laws. Under what law, under what authority would the President of the United States call up to 50,000 reservists, as he's just done?
Well, the President has the authority to do that, the inherent powers of the President to call up as many as are necessary in order to satisfy the national security requirements of the country.
Does he have to declare a national emergency to do that?
He doesn't have to declare a national emergency as such. I think he has the inherent powers, but everybody recognizes that we do have, in effect, a national emergency. But he has the inherent power to call up those forces as Commander-in-Chief.
I recognize I'm coming at you at this unexpectedly, but somewhere in my mind is the thought that if the President declares a partial mobilization, he may be required to declare a national emergency. And where I'm going with this is, to your knowledge, has he called this, is he in effect infecting a partial mobilization of forces?
I don't know that he's called for a partial mobilization at this point. I think he's calling up the reservists to help with serving at some of our air bases and other facilities, some of it for guard purposes, other for pilots who may be needed to fly some of the cover that we have over our airports right now, and others who may be forward deployed. In the event that we are required to take military action, they may very well participate in an active fashion in those operations. So I don't think he's called for mobilization at this point, but I think a call-up of the reserves is an indication this is a very serious matter, and indeed it's of an emergency nature.
Former Defense Secretary Bill Cohen, thanks, and we'll be talking to you as time goes along. The last time a United States president declared a partial mobilization and declared a national emergency in order to get that mobilization was January 18th, 1991, when the Gulf War was beginning. At that time, some 265,000 members of the National Guard and Reserve were activated, and in case you are interested, the United States has 1.3 million people in our military reserves. We go down to Mika Brzezinski, who is with Federal Emergency Management Agency personnel in Lower Manhattan. Mika?
Yeah, Dan, FEMA is here. I want to bring you back to the scene first, though. The rescue effort, as you know, is hampered by the rain. It is dangerous, it is treacherous, but they are still at it down there, and it really doesn't seem like anybody wants to stop no matter what. It's day 3 now in this new video that we have to show you, and the rescuers have been working in force. They are tired, they are cold, and they are hurting emotionally, but a few plan to stop anytime soon. The weather making it dangerous for volunteers there. I spoke to some volunteers earlier who said they were turned away from some parts of the scene because it is just too slippery and it is just too dangerous. Now, things are feeling more coordinated in terms of the rescue effort and also the recovery effort. I'm standing right next to West Street. It's a major thoroughfare that goes right down to the scene, and I've been here since this whole disaster happened. And in a much more methodical fashion, construction trucks and ambulances and EMTs and trucks carrying heavy equipment have been making their way slowly down West Street and then dropping off their material and then heading back. It's almost procession-like, and it is endless, and it goes through the night. Things more coordinated in that fashion, also more coordinated in terms of relief. And I mean specifically federal relief. The Federal Emergency Management Agency is on the scene, and they're trying to get to people to let them know what they can do for them. And I'm joined by Michael Beeman. He's of FEMA. He is the Chief of External Affairs. And you say there is a lot of money that is ready to go.
Yeah, there's a lot ready. We're ready to help the community to start to recover, and that's what we really want to do, is let people get on with their lives. And what we need to do is get them to call to our toll-free number. That starts the registration process. After that, it's seamless to them. They do no paperwork unless there's a requirement for them to get an SBA loan, but they just simply will do that, tell a registration number, and that will start the ball rolling, and there's a lot of things there for them.
All right, you mentioned the phone number. Why don't we put that up right now? I have it. It's 1-800-462-9029, and we can keep that up. I'll say it again, 1-800-462-9029. People who are watching are wondering if they're eligible. Who's eligible?
Well, they shouldn't worry about eligibility. They should simply call the phone number and tell them that they were in the affected area, and don't worry about eligibility.
Do you have to live in the affected area or have a business there? Does it matter?
Let me cover 2 things here. One is that by the teleregistration, that's people that are in that general area. They've been affected. They may have damage to their apartment. They may have some sort of medical costs. They may have funeral costs. They may have rental assistance where they had to move out of the area because the power's off, and we can help them with rental assistance. Another category is unemployment. those people that are in the area that were employed by businesses down in here, all they have to do is go to the unemployment office. And that is not only people in New York, but New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania.
And if you've lost everything, you still should call and get the ball rolling. Michael Beeman of FEMA, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Dan, it is a very slow process here, but it is certainly not for lack of effort.
Mika Brzezinski in Lower Manhattan, where they're expecting the arrival any moment now of President Bush, who is in the area and is making his way to take his tour of that section of the city. Ed Bradley has one individual story of survival. Ed?
It's someone named Fareed Paul. Dan, we talked to him at St. Vincent's Hospital, working at Solomon Smith Barney on Tuesday, the day that this happened, right next to the World Trade Center, broke his ankle being evacuated, and spoke today at St. Vincent's Hospital about what he saw there.
I saw people in the window waving white sheets, and that's what breaks my heart. It was a heart-wrenching noticing these people were trapped up there, and there's no way of them being rescued, and that really hurt me. And also seeing my own two eyes, that plane coming out of nowhere in slow motion and turning and hitting directly into the building it's just unreal. It's just unreal. It's something I'll never forget for the rest of my life.
Dan, there are another 4,300 people who are listed as injured, still 4,700 missing, 184 confirmed dead. And I want to correct, if I may, something that we said earlier. We had an AP report on the storming of the mosque in Bridgeville, Illinois, that turns out was incorrect. This, according to our station, WBBM in Chicago, is actually what happened, that there were several hundred Arab Americans who were marching to their mosque in support of the United States, in support of those who were killed in New York and Washington, and that there were a dozen or more bystanders who were yelling abuse at them. But the police did not have to turn people back who were walking on the mosque. In fact, these were Arab Americans walking to their mosque to pray in a show of solidarity and support for fellow Americans who were killed.
And they were harassed on their way?
By just a handful of people. Some yelled abuse at them, saying, "Go home."
I suppose it's inevitable. It's unfortunate to say the least. Joining us now in Washington is former United States Senator Warren Rudman, who is co-chairman of the Commission on National Security for the 21st Century. Good to see you again, Senator.
Hello, Dan.
Let's cut to the core. There's been a tremendous intelligence failure here. Why didn't the $25 billion a year U.S. intelligence apparatus pick up some warning, any warning of this attack?
Well, of course, by definition, Dan, anytime something like this happens you don't know about, it's an intelligence failure. I guess the more important question is why, and that's the one you ask. These organizations are extraordinarily difficult to penetrate. They're not like CIA activities that are directed towards a nation. They are shadowy organizations, some of whom we do not even know exist. Everybody is pointing the finger at bin Laden. That well may be right, but there are other organizations. There's always the possibility of state sponsorship. And if these folks don't use the telephone a great deal and 40 or 50 people involved in an enterprise are very careful, very hard to pick up what their intentions are. For all we know, there are groups plotting other actions against this country, and as hard as we may try, it is very difficult with intelligence. That is not to say that we shouldn't change our methods. One of the things our commission recommends is a much higher degree of focus on terrorism against the United States.
Well, true or untrue that in the high-tech revolution, we've gone high-tech in gathering intelligence, and I keep hearing at the expense of humans on the ground, that this is one of the problems with our intelligence network. So
well,
speak to us about that. Is that true?
It is true, but let me simply add this. Human intelligence has suffered a great deal in this country since the 70s when major changes were made in how the CIA operates. In addition to that, there have been a whole number of politically correct decisions made about the kind of people the CIA can use to penetrate certain kinds of organizations. Now, the fact is that you're not going to use nuns from Mother Teresa's hospital to penetrate terrorist organizations. You're probably going to use some people who are pretty rotten people who are willing to work with you, probably for money. The CIA has been essentially barred from doing that. Number two, no matter who you try to use, to penetrate an organization such as bin Laden's, such as Hamas, is extraordinarily difficult, probably far more difficult than it was for the CIA during the Cold War to penetrate the Kremlin. So we're faced with an enormous intelligence challenge. That is not to say we're going to have to do more and try harder.
Senator Rudman, when one passes the Central Intelligence Building just outside Washington, when you go past the NSA, National Security Agency facilities, rightly or wrongly, one has to think, whew, huge bureaucracy, top-heavy. You agree?
Oh, we certainly do. As a matter of fact, in another capacity that I've served in the last few years, there have been strong recommendations for major changes to the NSA. Having said that, the American people have to understand that if communications are done in a covert way, it is difficult for NSA or any other intelligence organization to pick up what people are saying to each other. You know, Dan, back in the 70s and the 80s, foreign leaders talked to each other very freely over telephones, over wireless telephones. Not anymore.
Is it true to your knowledge, Senator, that ever since 1988, American intelligence agencies have had the so-called green light to get Osama bin Laden, and for all of these years have been unable to do so?
There have been executive orders going back at least to that date dealing with him and with others. There have been massive efforts, a great deal of money spent, but as I think Secretary Cohen was talking about in the previous segment, when you're talking about going after someone who's hiding in some valley in a remote area of Afghanistan and whose financial network is handled by people who we don't even know who they are, this is very difficult. This is an unconventional challenge, and the American people are probably in for a, I'm sorry to say, a long siege. As you know from the report, which I know you looked at, one of the things that unfortunately we predicted in March is that large numbers of Americans would die on American soil because of terrorism. We called it the single most important threat for this government to deal with above all else. Unfortunately, we were right.
Former Senator Warren Rubin, co-chairman of the Commission on National Security for the 21st Century. Thank you. And we go now to David Martin at the Pentagon. David.
Dan, earlier we reported that the Defense Department and the FBI was investigating the fact that two of the names on that list of 19 hijackers were identical to the names of two Middle East Air Force officers who had attended U.S. military schools, one of them at an Air Force base in Texas and the other at an Air Force base in Alabama. Well, Air Force officers have run that to ground, they think, and they have told me they are confident that although the names are identical, the people are not. They are not one and the same. So I think we can, at least for now, put that one to rest. It does not appear that any of these hijackers attended U.S. military schools.
David, let me follow up on that, and I say this with great respect. There's always a tendency, whether you're at CBS News or in the Air Force, to try to cover your backside. Does this have a sense of that, or are you convinced that this is credible, that the Air Force saying the names are the same, but we didn't have these guys, we didn't help teach these guys?
Well, I can't imagine what percentage there would be in trying to mislead me on that, because all the facts are going to come out here in very short order. So I take them at their word.
David Martin at the Pentagon. Government authorities say that 190 people, a combination of military and civilian employees on the ground and the passengers in the plane, were believed to have died when that aircraft hit the Pentagon. About 1/3 of the 6 million square foot building, the Pentagon, is unusable right now because of the collapse of the section where the plane hit, also because of the ensuing fire and water damage. This is according to the Director of Federal Facilities, Mr. John F. Irby. Irby said repairing the destroyed areas of the Pentagon would take several years and cost more than $100 million, but less than $1 billion. And Irby put it bluntly about the Pentagon, we took a big hit. Ed?
Or you can see it. I mean, it's just looking at the destruction that's there. It's amazing when you think of it, that something like this could have happened. I mean, and I think it's talking about the difficulty Senator Rudman was in putting human intelligence in place in those countries. We're such an open society that we are a nation of immigrants. People come from different places all over the world and live here quite openly. we expect, particularly in a city like New York, to see people from different backgrounds, different cultures. It's much more difficult to insert people in societies like the Taliban in Afghanistan and some of these close-knit clans and families in the Middle East. In the United States, it's quite easy. It's done every day.
Well, which brings us to the point that the Immigration Service and the Customs Service have been asking for more money for, in effect, security. They haven't gotten it. You're watching continuing CBS News coverage of America Rising on this National Day of Prayer and Remembrance. Dan Rather at CBS News World Headquarters in New York with our continuing CBS News coverage on the attack on America on this day of remembrance with America Rising. It's 3:30 in the East now. The headlines at this half-hour mark: America Rising indeed. President Bush arrived in the New York area to offer consolation and support with a visit to Ground Zero, the collapsed Trade Center towers. Heavy rains have impeded search teams at the site, but determination to get the job done remains high. Earlier, at services at Washington's National Cathedral, the president said, and I quote, "Unity against terror is now extended across the world," unquote. U.S. authorities say 2 people they have in custody are now cooperating in the investigation. In fact, they've flipped somebody, they think, 2 somebodies, they think, who were in some ways connected to the operation. And the indication is that these people may have significant knowledge. 4,000 FBI agents are on the case, and many local and regional law enforcement operations are helping them, as well as many overseas. Secretary of State Powell underscores the U.S. will not differentiate between terrorists and those who harbor them. There are now 19 known hijackers in the planes used in the mass suicide murder attacks. President Bush has authorized the call-up of as many as 50,000 National Guardsmen and reservists for relief and security duty inside the U.S. More reserves and National Guardsmen may be called up later. There are military air patrols flying in the New York to Washington corridor, and fighter pilots on alert at 26 military bases across the country. Congress this afternoon passed $40 billion in probably what will turn out to be beginning funding for disaster relief and special defense spending. The recovered flight data recorders from the Pentagon and Pennsylvania plane crashes may contain some useful information. The Pentagon plane's cockpit voice recorder, so far, it's been recovered, but it's yielded no useful information. It was damaged, but that doesn't mean that in some ways they may yet get some information off of it. Now, for an update at the White House, CBS News Chief White House Correspondent John Roberts. John?
Dan, further to your conversation with former Secretary of Defense William Cohen just a little while ago about the issue of national emergency. A little while ago, Dan, the president sent to Congress the following letter. He says, "I hereby report that I have exercised my authority to declare a national emergency by reason of the terrorist attacks at the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon and the continuing and immediate threat of further attacks on the United States." So, Dan, that would certainly explain why there is such heightened concerns about security, why the president and the vice president have been moved to separate locations, why there is a 12-block cordon around the White House, why he left for New York aboard Air Force One with a couple of F-15s trailing him, and certainly would give him all the authorization that he needs to call up the reserve forces. You know, there's a real sense, Dan, that today perhaps we have turned a corner between the prayer and remembrance service today at the National Cathedral and the issuance of this declaration of a national emergency. We're moving indelibly down the road toward war against whoever is responsible. But as one historian told me, Dan, this is an incredibly complex issue, perhaps the most complex issue that any president has faced since the Civil War. There is no clear-cut enemy here, no clear-cut way to go after that enemy. And yesterday we had a briefing from a senior administration official who said, this is going to take a long time, so America had better be prepared for this, and at the very least, some inconvenience for weeks and months, perhaps even years. And, Dan, there's a sense that when you look at the reports that came out of Dallas from Maureen Maher, there certainly is a lot of fear among the American public as to whether or not there is safety in the skies, whether or not there is safety in the ground. And the administration, Dan, at least over the last 24 hours, continuing to suggest that those fears may be both well-founded and may be with us for some time to come.
John Roberts at the White House. President Bush has arrived in the area of the destruction in New York City. The president flying up to Manhattan after the services at the National Cathedral this morning. It takes a while to get things organized, no matter how much planning there has been. And the president flew by helicopter to Andrews Air Force Base, then flew by Air Force One up to the New York area, and now has flown in by helicopter. The helicopter pad, well, probably better not to say what the pad is, but helicopter pad, and from here he'll be driven over, and he'll also have a fly around the lower part of Manhattan to see firsthand what has happened, to hear firsthand from the people who are doing the hard work, iron workers, construction workers of all kinds, as well as firemen and police, nurses, doctors. As we await seeing the president and his party actually make the tour, one keeps in mind that President Bush has declared a national emergency, and by declaring that, among other things, it gives him the clear authority to call up National Guardsmen and reserves, which he has done, up to 50,000 in what may turn out to be a first call. Yet, as we have this sort of pause between seeing pictures of the president make his tour, I keep thinking to myself, you know, this is as terrible as the Oklahoma City bombing was, and it was absolutely terrible. April 19th, 1995. It killed 168 people, including 19 children. Each tower of the World Trade Center was 10 times the size of the Murrah Building. The Murrah Building had 9 floors. I think you mentioned this the other day. The World Trade Towers, 110 stories each.
Coming down on top of each other, one by one.
And part of what the president will see today is that it isn't just a case of rubble and debris on top of the ground. The force of that avalanche of concrete and steel forced a great deal of destruction underground.
And there's also another difference between this and the Murrah Building, is that you didn't have the kind of heat that came from the fire.
Well, that's the biggest difference, I would
caused
say,
by this jet fuel.
in terms of what caused it.
Yeah. I mean, you had temperatures of 2,000 degrees. It just turns that structural steel soft and mushy, and it collapsed. I mean, that's what's holding it up. You do have underground. I mean, there was a subway station under there, a train station under there, the garages underneath, and all of that just came right down on top of it.
Ed, as we await seeing the president make his tour around, we want to go back to some of the things the president said today at that service at Washington's National Cathedral. Here is some of what the president had to say.
Just 3 days removed from these events, Americans do not yet have the distance of history, but our responsibility to history is already clear: to answer these attacks and rid the world of evil. War has been waged against us by stealth and deceit and murder. This nation is peaceful, but fierce when stirred to anger. This conflict was begun on the timing and terms of others. It will end in a way and at an hour of our choosing.
Some of what the president had to say today at the National Cathedral. Now, the president's helicopter is beginning to move into position here in New York City, and maybe a few moments before we see the president. In the meantime, helicopters, you know, it's a flotilla of helicopters with any president, facilitates his movement into tight places such as this.
And whichever one he's on becomes Marine One.
Right. One of the things the President Bush and those around him have been pretty smart about is to realize that not only for security concerns, but to bring a whole presidential entourage into Manhattan by car It simply ties up traffic even more than it's normally tied up. And, so increasingly in recent years, the move has been, well, we can bring the president in by helicopter, better do it that way rather than drive him in. And of course, under these circumstances, for security reasons, it certainly would be unwise to take any chance driving the president in. Although, perish the thought that helicopters are very vulnerable flying machines. That's one reason that you have high-performance combat aircraft flying high above this whole scene, and indeed patrolling the Washington-New York corridor.
Well, you can imagine the security that's in place there where the helicopter has landed, as well as the security that was at the National Cathedral in Washington. I mean, here is an event where anyone knows everyone is going to be there.
As we show you the pictures of the president's helicopter arriving, I'm going to bring in, at least in voiceover fashion, the governor of Oklahoma, Governor Frank Keating. Governor, thanks for being with us. After Oklahoma City and the Murrah bombing, did you ever think you would see anything even approaching what we're looking at today in Lower Manhattan?
Well, our tragedy was an incredible tragedy, but this is a cataclysm. The numbers of lives lost, as you noted, the size of the buildings, the tremendous loss of property. It's going to be a long time rebuilding, a long time recovering. Very, very tough.
How big a change do you think we'll see in our beloved country as a result of what happened?
Well, I think the first thing, of course, is to focus on rescue and recovery, as we did in Oklahoma City and as the president is doing now, and then to focus on identifying who did it. And then after that, making sure those people never walk the face of the earth again, to destroy those that are responsible. But I think after that, there's no question in my mind, Dan, and U.S. Customs and the Immigration Service at one time in my career were under me. It's going to be more difficult to get on an airplane, and it's going to be more difficult to come into the country, and I don't think that's all bad.
Governor, Winston Churchill rallied Great Britain in the face of Nazi terror in the 1930s, and President John F. Kennedy later wrote a book about, why England slept, to say nothing of why we slept when the storm was brewing. Would you agree or disagree that, as hard as it is to say it, that we were napping, we were sleeping, such things as we know the Immigration Service and the Customs Service needed beefing up, and we just haven't done it?
Well, I think one of your previous guests said it correctly. America is a nation of many cultures, a Joseph's Cloak society. We have many different faces, nations, religions, nationalities, race, colors, and sexes, so it doesn't really surprise us to see people that don't look like us. Not that we want to change that at all, we don't. But I think we can be far more careful when people come into the country that the visas that they have are bona fide visas and that they are here for a legitimate purpose. Once people are in America, the Constitution applies, and it's awfully difficult to get them out or to have them less than American citizens, whether they're aliens, resident, or otherwise. We have over 20 million people visiting the United States, legal and illegal, at any given time. So it's important to have the resources at the border to make sure that individuals that we don't want to come into the United States don't. That's going to be a challenge, a big challenge.
One of our many challenges. Governor, taking a slightly different direction because you have so much experience with this, in the wake of the Murrah bombing in Oklahoma City, what worked in terms of giving people who suffered post-traumatic stress disorders and other psychological, even psychiatric problems help?
Well, I think the first thing that needed to be done is what the president did today. We're a spiritual people. We go to church more often in synagogue and mosque more often than most people of the world. So focus on a healing process. Ask for God's help during this very, very difficult time. And then bring in not only secular, but obviously sectarian ministers and priests and rabbis to help. This is going to be a very difficult time for people to get out of the basement, so to speak. You're going to have lots of lost lives, children killed in these airplanes, relatives and friends who are badly mauled, injured, and killed. So that's a big part of it. And then to come together as a country. What we did was identify the children who were lost in our tragedy, and we provided a free college education for every one of them from private sources. And that was a pride statement, a togetherness statement that we had in Oklahoma. Those are the kind of things we Americans are going to have to do together to help our friends in New York. And our friends in New York came to help us, Dan. The police department and the fire service, they were firstest with the mostest. Ray Downey, my friend, the chief who was killed at the Trade Center, that wonderful, highly professional group of men and women, we're going to miss all of them, but they have to understand that every one of us care about them, and we're going to see them through.
Frank Keating, Governor of Oklahoma, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Dan.
Well, President Bush, as you have seen, has arrived at the helipad secured for him very near where the worst damage and the most casualties occurred when the World Trade Center Twin Towers were hit and collapsed, with almost 5,000 people missing in this area. So what we'll see now is the president making his rounds. And one of the things we know that President Bush is very good at, he's excellent with people, the kind of working people, although you can say, well, he was born to privilege, a situation over which he had no control. But one of the things that's made him an effective campaigner, an effective politician, and an effective leader is his ability to relate to people one-on-one, relate to small groups of people.
Stop.
And he is exceptionally good at visiting at this level. You would say, well, certainly this is a unique situation, and indeed it is. But to this cataclysmic, never-before-in-history situation, he brings skills and strength of leadership in this particular kind of thing that we'll see in evidence as he goes along over the next hour or so.
I wonder if he is going to, in addition to going to what they're calling Ground Zero, the site, also visit some of those people who've been injured, or if they've gathered some of the people who are still looking for those who are missing, because there's still people out there who haven't given up hope yet.
I think part of that will be a security decision. We'll see. He went to Washington Hospital to visit some of the victims of the Pentagon bombing the other day. But we'll see. There certainly are security concerns today. But I would say, based on all of his past performances, his instinct would be to, yes, go to a hospital, talk to people who have the missing. But many of those decisions will be made on the recommendation of the Secret Service and others responsible for the president's protection. It is true in saying the president makes his own decisions, but it's the rare president who wants to override the recommendations of the people who are responsible for his safety. The memorial service in Washington was only one of many held in this country and abroad. And to get a sense of what happened in some places overseas, we go to London and our CBS News correspondent, Mark Phillips. Mark?
Well, Dan, there have been a lot of supportive and sympathetic words and gestures here and across the world over the past few days, but most of those have come from official, governmental, and diplomatic sources. Today here in London, the sympathy and the expression of compassion for America was not just official, it was personal. The main event was at St. Paul's Cathedral, where a memorial service was held. This one began extraordinarily with the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner. The church was filled, this historic church was filled not just with the great and the good of British society. The Queen was there, government leaders were there, Tony Blair was there, the U.S. Ambassador William Farish was also there. But anybody who wanted to get into the church, into the cathedral, and who got there early enough also got in. And not only that, thousands of people who couldn't fit inside the cathedral jammed the streets outside of it. They were presented with programs of the service and sang along both with the anthem and with the hymns later on. Prayers were said for the security services, for the rescue services, for the people who had died, of course, and people who tried to rescue them. London today at St. Paul's Cathedral. Ed?
It's interesting to note that in Iran. In addition to, you would expect it in Britain, we heard it in Paris, where the metro set down, where the bells were pealing from Notre Dame Cathedral. But this just came in from Iran, where the hatred that has been expressed for the United States was set aside, as 60,000 spectators sat quietly in their seats at a stadium in Tehran, and the players stood on the field silently for 1 minute before a World Qualifying Cup match, something that you might expect from a country in Western Europe. It's interesting to see that coming in from Iran. Let's now go down to Washington, where Bob Schieffer is standing by on Capitol Hill. Bob?
Ed, I was just watching those pictures there at that ground zero, as you call it, just a minute ago, and as you and Dan were talking about the enormity of all this, it strikes me that in the end we may come to believe, and it may well be true, that more people, more Americans died last Tuesday in one single event than in any other time in American history. I know the Battle of Antietam in the Civil War, more than 4,000 people died, 6,000 people died in a hurricane in Galveston, Texas in 1900. But more people died on Tuesday in Lower Manhattan than died in the entire American Revolution. Here in Washington, the work goes on. Congress earlier today passed that $40 billion aid package for the city of New York. Half of that, of course, will go for tracking down the terrorists and will be used for military purposes. $20 billion of it will go to New York. But when we talk about the complexity of what has happened here and how complicated and far-reaching this problem is, we also have to think about the American economy. Congress this afternoon is trying to put together some kind of an aid package for the American airlines, a package of loans and economic assistance, something in the neighborhood, we're told, of $2.5 billion. Now, that is far from a done deal, but it just underlines, Ed, and underlines, Dan, how enormous this is, because if we have one of these airlines go down, it could well throw the country into a recession, and that is one of the things that they're so worried about. We know that Midway Airlines has already gone into bankruptcy when they were forced to shut down for a couple of days. There are also problems for the others. Dan?
Bob, one question very quickly. Is there any one airline or maybe two that they are more worried about than the others around Congress?
Well, I think you've got to be worried about American Airlines, and you've got to be worried about United Airlines, because these airlines, certainly while they're two of the biggest airlines, they have had these enormous losses. But then you have other airlines that, just because this cash flow has been cut off, Dan, for the past few days, and I'm not an expert on which is the healthiest airline, but you have to be concerned about some of them as well, because the profit margins are not all that great these days.
Thanks, Bob Schieffer on Capitol Hill. We go to Mark Strassman. Mark is at the airport in Atlanta. Mark, how's it moving there?
Dan, it's moving fine here in Atlanta, at least as well as can be expected. About 40% of flights are going to get out today. But I have some late-breaking airport security news from Chicago, where Midway Airport has now been closed down. Our affiliate WBBM-TV in Chicago reports not only closed down, but sealed off. The FBI has detained 3 people, do not know the circumstances of any of that, and also do not know when Midway will be reopened. But all I can tell you is that Midway is now closed. It joins Reagan National Airport in Chicago and Boston's Logan Airport as airports that are not functioning right now, planes neither coming nor going, and people have to find other ways of traveling. Atlanta's airport, which I mentioned is open, is also an interesting snapshot of America 3 days after the terrorist attack. There are so many conflicting emotions gathered here, along with all these people trying to get their lives back together, not just their traveling lives, but their senses of self. They are wondering, for example, about their fear of flying. Should they be afraid? They're a little bit uncertain about America's next move and their next move. What will be the impact on their lives, on the economy, for example? And they're also fighting their anger. A lot of folks here smoldering, simmering with anger. They resent being made to feel unsafe in their own country, and they gathered, a couple hundred of them, at noon today during the nationwide moment of silence. There was a ring of remembrance in the atrium of Atlanta's airport. A couple hundred people gathered, holding hands and praying. They prayed for their country, they prayed for those lost, and of course they prayed for themselves as well. And after it was over, Dan, I asked a woman whether she thought that that prayer was a healing experience. And what she said was, and I'm quoting here, those terrorists can destroy our monuments and they can destroy many lives, but they'll never break the American spirit. And I think, Dan, that was very well put.
Indeed, Mark Strassman. Mark, to clear up one thing, and as one who's misspoken himself much more than I should have over the last few days, you said at Reagan National Airport in Chicago that things were not moving. Did you mean O'Hare Airport in Chicago or the National Airport in Washington?
Midway in Chicago, National Airport, Reagan National in Washington, Boston Logan. Those three right now are not moving.
Mark Strassman, thanks. Let's go to Bobby Harley in Miami for information on the FBI investigation in South Florida, where it turns out that a disturbing number of these assassins in the sky were trained. Bobby?
Well, that's right, Dan. It turns out that the majority of the hijackers that the FBI has now identified all had connections to Florida, and all of them led seemingly routine lives as they trained as pilots here.
For more than a year, as many as a handful of the suspected terrorists lived quietly in Florida neighborhoods.
They just blended in so well that, I mean, it didn't really mean anything to us, you know, just normal families playing, and they just lived a normal life and stuff.
In this Vero Beach community, Abdul Alamari, one of the now dead suspected pilots, moved in a year ago to take flying lessons a short distance away at Flight Safety Academy. Neighbors say he kept to himself.
I'd see him come and go, and I'd wave at him, never talk to him.
But he lived next door to another Saudi student pilot, Adnan Bukhari, who a local furniture store salesman said bought a living room set the day of the attacks and wanted it shipped immediately to Saudi Arabia, telling the salesman,
I'm going to Saudi Arabia. I don't want to be in America anymore.
The FBI detained, questioned, and released Bukhari after finding he was not involved in the hijackings, but federal authorities continue to look for a third associate of both Vero Beach men, Amir Kamfar. But it is Mohammed Atta who people across Florida seem to remember the most. The FBI say he and his cousin, Marwan al-Shahehi, were on the two planes that crashed into the World Trade Center. The two also traveled together in Florida, renting a room for a week with Charlie Voss in Venice Beach while taking flying lessons at nearby Huffman Aviation. And then on to several apartments in Coral Springs, Hollywood, and Delray Beach, Florida, but only calling the most attention to themselves the Friday night before the attacks, after drinking in a bar.
The guy was here, he gave us a hard time and everything, and that he was bragging that he was a big shot, and, you know, and then he left. And, you know, and he paid the bill and then he left.
The obvious concern for the FBI is now if all of these hijackers, 12 of the now dead hijackers, lived what appeared to be such normal lives in Florida, could there be more out there, still undetected? Dan?
Bobby Harley in South Florida. Well, accompanied by New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani and the governor of the state, New York Governor George Pataki, on Marine One, President Bush surveyed the wreckage from the air before landing in Lower Manhattan a short while ago to visit rescue workers and inspect the destruction firsthand. Fighter jets escorted the presidential plane Air Force One from the Washington area. Some of the rain has let up. It's been raining in New York today, the first day that the rescue and recovery workers have had to work in the rain. One other note that is of some interest, from their lofty spot 250 miles above Earth, the astronauts aboard the International Space Station saw dark smoke bellowing from New York on Tuesday. Those of you who were with us on Tuesday may remember we showed photographs from the space station about that. Within the last 24 hours, the space station's commander, retired U.S. Navy pilot Frank Culberson, noticed something else. Eerie, haunting, the absence of jet vapor trails. Said Frank Culberson, normally when we go over the U.S., the sky is like a spider web of contrails, and now the sky is just about completely empty. It's very, very weird. Well, Ed Bradley, that will end fairly soon because we are beginning to have some air traffic over the U.S. although up to now there's been no foreign air traffic into the country.
Well, there were those exceptions for Alitalia that had been diverted to Canada, and they returned yesterday to San Francisco and I think Seattle or San Jose. But today, Reuters is reporting that British Airways said that they have received permission to fly to the United States. They're sending 2 planes today to pick up passengers who had been stranded in the United States, in New York and in Philadelphia. And then tomorrow they expect to, these planes will be empty. They expect to fly people on Saturday from Britain, from London, back to the United States. So it is slowly getting back up, but nowhere near normal at all.
Well, this is true with overall air travel in the country. It's slowly inching its way back, but it's going to be very slow indeed. This is CBS News, continuing coverage of America Rising on this National Day of Prayer and Remembrance.